Welcome to Meet JMT, Insights from Within, a series that introduces our industry professionals and provides them the opportunity to share their professional experiences, personal reflections, and sources of inspiration as individuals working in the architecture, engineering, and construction sectors.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another Meet JMT Podcast. My name is Jennifer, and I am your host and digital marketing manager here at JMT. In honor of STEM STEAM Day, we are shining a spotlight on Glenn Havinoviski. Glenn is Vice President and Director of Intelligent Transportation Systems in our technology group, and he's located in Herndon, Virginia, near Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today, Glenn. Would you mind telling our listeners a little bit more about yourself, your role here at JMT, as well as what this observance means to you personally?
Well, first, thanks, Jennifer, for having me. I've been looking forward to talking to you. I've been leading the firm's national practice for Intelligent Transportation Systems, or ITS, since joining JMT in June of 21. So it's been about 3.5 years, and I'm going on 40 years in the consulting business in January. But I've been mainly focused on ITS and transportation system management and operations, of which ITS is a key tool. Historically, I've worked all over the U.S. and abroad, including the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, as well as in California and Florida, the Midwest, and the East Coast. Mainly my home base since '97 has been in the Washington, D.C. area, particularly Northern Virginia. That said, having several major airports in the area has allowed me to work in many different places when I've needed to, which has allowed me to sample the finest in airport cuisine. So relative to what I do at JMT, I'm helping to market our ITS services around the country, and I'm serving as a project manager on several of our exciting efforts. I come from a fairly conventional background as a civil engineering graduate in the mid-1980s. And so we're talking a lot about younger people as part of STEM Day. Engineering wasn't always the hottest profession in the world, especially in the early to mid-80s. Everybody was excited about MBAs. That's what the cool people had, especially if you wanted to be like Gordon Gekko from Wall Street. So the engineers and computer science majors were still considered the nerds. We weren't yet the cool people. So it is interesting nowadays, and actually it's great to see younger people, even at the high school level, being interested in engineering. And in particular, I see a lot more women being interested than ever before. We see it in our visits when we go to high schools, and we have different STEM events where we invite people to sample automated vehicle technologies as well as visit our exhibits. And I'm truly excited about our next generation of engineers. Just a personal story here. I was at a friend's house for dinner a few weeks ago, and I met their niece. And when she found out I was an engineer, she was very excited, and she talked about how much she was enjoying her engineering design class. So I asked her what college she was going to, and I found out she was a high school freshman. So they really are starting earlier and earlier.
Well, thank you so much for that additional introduction. And I agree, it's fantastic to see more young people getting excited about engineering and STEM initiatives. It's also great to hear that, despite the trend of achieving the MBA, you stuck to what you were passionate about doing and have clearly made a fantastic career in doing so. What were some of your inspirations leading to your professional career in transportation technology?
While I was in engineering school, I was at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. During alternate semesters, I worked for over 2 years in a cooperative engineering program with the Illinois Department of Transportation. The rotation included surveying, drafting, concrete inspection, and then working in a traffic operations center, which in the early 1980s was pretty interesting. It was pretty innovative. You had these big computers the size of washers and dryers, and really with less memory than your typical iPhone has these days. You had a big wall map with color LEDs representing the traffic sensors and the amount of traffic that the sensors was picking up. And you'd have this gigantic industrial console to control all the ramp meters on the expressways throughout the Chicago area. It was kind of like mission control in Houston for the Apollo flights, or like an air traffic control center, but for cars. And I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And you could monitor the entire expressway network in the nation's second largest city at the time, which is what the center in Chicago did. And that was something I was very excited about, and it kind of established my interest in transportation technology. And it wasn't called ITS at the time. It was basically computerized traffic control is what it was known as, or expressway surveillance. Nobody had come up with any creative acronyms to describe it yet. When I did graduate from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and began working full-time, it was in the consulting world. And the big trend where I was working was in the computerization of traffic signal operations and then connecting traffic signals to these central computers using telephone communications. So in my first few years of my consulting career, I did work in New York City, in the Bronx. I did some work in Baltimore County, Maryland, and in Hartford, Connecticut, which is where I was living at the time and where I eventually met my wife. I also worked with the traffic engineer in Burlington, Vermont, in the middle of winter to put our traffic signal timings on an electrical mechanical controller in 15-degree temperatures. It was quite a bit different than working in a traffic operations center. It is the ultimate in hands-on operation. So fast forward about a decade into the 1990s, we had the beginnings of a federal program that's now known as ITS that incorporated activities like computerizing traffic signals as well as regional freeway management systems. Guess what? I was working on those kinds of things at the time. But ITS also added a lot of key elements like traveler information, vehicle roadside communications for electronic toll collection, and truck pre-clearance technologies that could reduce delays at weigh stations. It could introduce things like weigh in motion. You could store information about the truck weight and all its credentialing and its paperwork all electronically. So there were a lot of other things that ITS also did, but those were among the initial things that everybody thought would provide benefits for freight and for passenger travel. We also began doing a lot more design of fiber optics because ITS had video. ITS had lots of data being exchanged. So you had high bandwidth for video and data for any ITS deployments that was occurring pretty much around the country. So you're moving from twisted pair cable and microwave and other technologies to fiber optic. And it's interesting because we take that all for granted now. For my parts, my projects that I was involved in allowed me to work on the full life cycle of those activities, from planning the projects to designing the projects, putting my PE stamp on the plans, and then eventually implementation. Now, the implementation could be construction inspection. It could be the testing. A large part for me was doing the verification testing, making sure that the system was operating as per the specification. I also did a little bit of what was called validation testing, which was making sure that the right system was indeed designed to solve the problems that we had identified. So those are all very, very important parts of the system engineering process. Again, things today that we take for granted, but when I was doing that, I was actually teaching the system engineering process back in the early 2000s. It was still a relatively new thing. I also got involved in a number of other things like toll express lane projects. I was involved in the first toll express lane in Minnesota along Interstate 394 in the early 2000s. And then eventually here in Northern Virginia, I was involved in the I-495 and I-95 express lanes, both in the design and in the case of the 95 express lanes, the preliminary design. And the things that are there now were all basically in the locations that we laid out in the preliminary design. I am still active in the managed lanes world as a member of the Transportation Research Board's Managed Lanes Committee. So I've been involved in a number of conferences and as a moderator and a speaker, and hopefully at some point a thought leader in this area. I'm also interested in making transit work better. That's another area that's very passionate for me, and making transit work within day-to-day traffic operations. One of my early projects, I did a design for a bus signal priority project in Norwalk, Connecticut in the mid-'80s to help get buses out of this very tight little downtown bus terminal every half hour. You'd have the operator turning a key on this electronic box, and it would flush the lights, traffic lights green, so all the buses would leave at the same time every half hour. And to see it working was actually really cool. Later on, I worked in a lot more sophisticated projects. I worked on the Metro Blue Line in Los Angeles and Long Beach, California. When I was living out in California, I worked on systems that would allow light rail vehicles to trigger traffic signals within both the LA and Long Beach downtown areas. And a few years later, when I moved back to the East Coast, I got to go back to the place I grew up, Cleveland, Ohio, for a project called, at that time, the Euclid Corridor, and is now called the Health Line. It's one of the more famous bus rapid transit projects in the United States. It runs the length of Euclid Avenue in the city of Cleveland, which is one of their main thoroughfares. It uses dedicated bus lanes, prioritized traffic signal operations, and light rail style station infrastructure for buses. What was unusual is the buses had left-hand doors as well as right-hand doors, kind of like light rail vehicles. And the project won some awards about 12 or 13 years ago.
What an incredible journey you've had in the engineering field. Can you tell us about what some of the trends in this industry are nowadays?
The big trend is connected and automated vehicles. You may have heard about the robo-taxis, automated trucks, automated shuttle services. The big area of interest is vehicles communicating with the road infrastructure and other vehicles. So that goes beyond the old technologies of electronic tolling and traffic signal priority into the realm of safety. We at JMT have assisted in doing program management for moving these connected and automated vehicle initiatives forward in the state of Maryland. Our technology projects in other places like DC often include replacing the old infrastructure for traffic operations and deploying pedestrian and bicycle sensors, as well as new traffic signal controllers that allow for the sharing of data with vehicles as well as with the cloud, so that you have the ability to share a lot more information about what's happening on the transportation network.
Well, it's pretty amazing that you've witnessed firsthand the evolution of traffic management and ITS technologies over the decades, but it's also amazing to hear about JMT's role in advancing these initiatives in Maryland and beyond. Can you tell us about a significant project you've worked on and how that may have impacted you, our company, or even the AEC or technology industries as a whole?
Well, Jennifer, I've been fortunate to be involved in some of the precursors to what we now know as ITS, and on some of the earliest planning studies for ITS technology in the early 90s. I worked on a number of projects that no one had ever really done before. For example, for the Illinois Tollway in the early 2000s, we designed a traffic management system that monitored traffic sensors and toll tag data in order to display travel times on dynamic message signs. And, you take it for granted most state DOTs, if not all of them, have some kind of travel time information. Well, in the early 2000s, that was a brand new thing at the time. The system also pulled crash information from police and safety service, patrol, dispatch systems, and integrated it into its database to provide advisory information, assist in clearing incidents, and provide travel information for the public. And it wasn't long before every state DOT was doing those things with their systems. So it was kind of cool to have one of the first systems to do all these things. I also did a few projects in the Middle East starting in the early 2000s, including the very first ITS deployment in Dubai in the mid-2000s, at a time where U.S. companies and Americans in general were just discovering that city. And of course, that place today is like the city of the future. But when I first went there in 2001, it was really only getting started. It was still a well-kept secret. I remember walking on the beach at night there, and I felt like I was literally at the end of the world. It was really amazing. Now, of course, it's become this big international city with all these amazing metro systems and all this development and everything. Later on, actually it was about 11 or 12 years ago, I worked on a traveler information and traffic data sharing system nearby in Abu Dhabi. This includes developing a real-time mobile app for traffic information, for booking taxis, getting live airport parking information, and also real-time data for bus arrivals and schedules. So it was fun to see this system work, getting all this live information, but it was by far the toughest project I ever worked on. There were just so many expectations. Everything I've worked on lately at JMT is something new and exciting, certainly for JMT. One example evolves nicely from my early work in traffic signal computerization. Right now in Washington, D.C., where we're working for the District Department of Transportation, we've helped plan and are developing a series of procurement documents to replace 40-year-old traffic signal controller technologies at nearly 1,600 intersections, and we're replacing it with the latest advanced transportation controllers, or ATCs. And we've also helped them replace a 30-year-old traffic control system with one that can communicate both to their old traffic signal controllers as well as their new traffic signal controllers as each of the intersections gets upgraded. And now it's a true one JMT project. We like talking about one JMT, where we have multiple disciplines working on these different projects. This project incorporates both the system-oriented perspective of our technology group with the need for our traffic engineering experts to do some physical design plans at the numerous intersections where not only controllers, but other equipment such as telecommunications, conduits, cabling, etc., all need to be replaced.
Again, extremely interesting to hear about your experience in the development of ITS and these really early contributions to groundbreaking projects, as well as embodying the one JMT spirit while helping to modernize traffic signal technologies and systems. Are there any hobbies or interests outside of work that you feel have really influenced your professional journey?
I do lots of presentations, and everybody says, "Ooh, you got a good radio voice." And in fact, I was a former college radio DJ, and of course, for years and years, traveling around the country, traveling around the world. Suddenly, that all changed during the pandemic when I was no longer able to travel around the universe like I had in the past to do ITS. So I had an opportunity to go back and do something that I'd wanted to do for many, many years, which is go back and be a washed-up college DJ with a radio show. And there is a public access outlet that's funded through cable TV in Fairfax County, Virginia, called Fairfax Public Access. So I was given an opportunity to host a weekly show on Radio Fairfax entitled The Ready Kilowatt Hour. And it's on Thursday nights at 9 Eastern on Radio Fairfax, which you can access on the TuneIn app on your iPhone or Android. And we play over 60 years of both rock and roll. Recently, we moved the show from being pre-recorded on Wednesday nights late at night to a Thursday night 9 o'clock show live. And it's both exciting and anxiety-inducing, like any kind of public speaking is. And it's always easier to make things perfect when you pre-record it and then you edit it and you can make your voice sound different, etc. When you're doing it live, you have to get it as right as you can the first time. And I don't always do that. So it's kind of being live without a net, but I'm working at it. I think I'm doing pretty well as a live radio host.
Well, what a fun hobby to take on during the pandemic and, really stay connected to the outside world. I want to thank you so much for sharing your journey with us today. We like to end the podcast with a few words of wisdom. So were there any closing thoughts you would like to leave our listeners with, or words of inspiration for those interested in joining a STEM career one day?
Like Jennifer said earlier, figure out what is your passion. It often evolves with time as you realize what is possible and what you like doing. You should think about interning while you're in college in order to get an idea of what working in industry is like. I can tell you that interning is awesome, but I worked as a co-op student with the Illinois Department of Transportation. I worked on a rotation between different divisions, and over time I discovered what I liked, which happened to be the stuff that's now known as ITS. So being a transportation engineer is challenging, but it's also fun. And if you want the challenge and to eventually see your solutions in action, JMT is certainly the place for you.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the Meet JMT podcast today. Remember to subscribe, post a review, and of course, encourage your friends and colleagues to do the same.